So welcome everyone to the first ELIXIR webinar in what I hope will be a regular event. Every third Wednesday of every month we plan to share out interesting news and updates from the various ELIXIR projects. I'm Niklas Blomberg, I'm Director of ELIXIR, and what I'd like to do today is to take you through a little bit of the history of ELIXIR, or what we've actually achieved in our first year of operation, and some of the plans for next year. For this webinar, I would encourage you to mute your phone or mute your audio during the presentation. We will open up for questions and answers after the presentation. And of course, there is also a chat function within the webinar that you can use to ask questions that we'll try to address after the seminar. I should also say that we have announcements for upcoming webinars on our website, and we do record the webinars. There will also be an opportunity to watch it offline. I guess for most of you listening to this the first time, you may not want to hear it again. So the purpose of this is, of course, to ramp up the knowledge sharing within the infrastructure. We are a very large infrastructure. It's distributed. It's currently 12 members in 11 member states, and there is over 100 institutes linked into the infrastructure. So I think this will be one of many ways that we use to connect to each other and update on interesting science. I should also say that we are, of course, developing our websites, as you've seen, and over the coming weeks and months, I think you will see increasing use of the website for knowledge sharing within the infrastructure. So with this, I'd like to kick off and take a brief tour of what we achieved in the first year of ELIXIR. And obviously, the biggest thing that happened last year that we became legal. So ELIXIR is now 1 year and 1 week old. On the 14th of January last year, the consortium agreement went into legal force. And currently, there are 12 members of ELIXIR, 11 countries and EMBL that have signed the consortium agreement. And there are a further 6 countries that are actually, most of them very close to signing the consortium agreement. We're also discussing with additional countries. So I think during 2015, we will see a host of new countries joining the family, which is of course great. But I should also say that the focus in the first year had really been on bringing in the new member states. And we've actually established a new intergovernmental organization, which doesn't happen without a bit of organizational development. And as we're now moving into 2015, I think we will move more into the area of technical delivery and less focus on organizational development. So I will not dwell a lot on the structure, but I think it's important to recognize that actually ELIXIR isn't a monolithic infrastructure. We're distributed and we are based in our member states, and really it is centered around our national infrastructures. So I also want to take the opportunity to thank everyone within the member states that really have spent a lot of time and effort during last year to get collaboration agreements in place, but also to shape up and form the national infrastructures and understand how they link in to ELIXIR. I think it's also important to recognize that the national infrastructures actually are very different and variable. Some of them are mature and are single legal entities that have been in place for many years. I mean, SIB is the prototype here. The Swiss Institute of Bioinformatics have been around for 16 years. Most of our infrastructures or national nodes are consortium with the lead institute and are shaping up around the lead institute. Some of these have also been around for quite some time. Netherlands, Sweden, and Norway have had national consortium for many years. And then we have a group of countries where actually only now start to form the national networks. And sometimes this is linked with the first set of funding from national roadmaps. And one of the focuses in 2015, and I'll come back to that, will be on capacity building and help the national nodes to essentially organize themselves and get the national services in place. Because ELIXIR, as a distributed infrastructure, we need to deliver the services, or we will deliver the services through our national nodes, and we will do that where the users are. And I think that's one of the great strengths of a distributed or almost fractal organization. So possibly the most important deliverable last year was the ELIXIR program. So ELIXIR work around 5-year scientific programs and associated financial plans. And of course, developing the scientific program for a large distributed infrastructure is a big undertaking. And this involved over 100 people from the different national institutes through a series of work streams. The program was accepted by the ELIXIR board, and I think this gives us a very, very strong foundation for the activities that we are now running forward. So what I'll try to do is to explain some of what we do around the program, how that drives the current scientific efforts, but also how we use this as a basis for reaching out to other research infrastructures, so our sister infrastructures in the life sciences. The first thing I'd like to point out is that we are starting a new organization. So we're trying to face the implementation of this organization. And as we said in 2014, the focus was very much on coordination and building the infrastructure and integrating services and capacity across national node. This is by no means finished, and I think this is an important effort that will go on for actually several years. But over the next year, so this year in 2016, I think we have to focus much more on the deploying services. And I'll come back to that a little bit later in our webinar. So the ELIXIR program and the ELIXIR infrastructure is built around 5 themes. So the first theme, of course, is data, and really the need to integrate and sustain our core data resources. Life science has a tradition of open data and accessible data and accessible reference data. And indeed, I think it's unthinkable to do much of life science research without looking up a protein in UniProt or checking a genome structure in Ensemble and so on. And an important role for ELIXIR is to make sure that we find the evidence base and the technologies and the support to maintain and sustain these core data resources for the community. But it also is, of course, the data need to come into these data resources. And again, I think this is where the national nodes have a very important role to play. How do we connect data management practices at the local level, at the national level, with the efforts at the international level? And indeed, one of the things that we need to understand as an infrastructure is the separation of concerns. What is it that we should do locally, and what is it that we need to do nationally, and what needs to be done at the European? The second theme of ELIXIR is the tools infrastructure, and of course, data isn't very useful unless you have tools where you can exploit it or connect to the data or get access to the data and analyze the data. And one of the flagships here is, of course, the tools registry to try to build a catalog of the available tools throughout the nodes. And I think this is really important. It's a lot of tools out there. I think this is a foundation for developing the infrastructure forward. So this will really be the focus of the next 2 years. Of course, you don't only need data and tools, but you also need compute platforms to perform your calculations, access the data, exchange the data, and compute on the data. And we're doing a lot of efforts here, as many of you know, around virtual access or virtual machines, clouds. How do you exchange data between remote sites, so set up data roaming in Europe? And a particular challenge, I think, is sharing of human-sensitive research data and finding harmonized approaches to data exchange, but also data security and ethical consent. And this is where we can work very intensely with our sister infrastructures like the biobanks. I'll come back to that in a few slides. Then an important role for an infrastructure, and especially I think a strength of a distributed infrastructure, is how do we implement standards. So through our national nodes, all of you, we reach out essentially to every university or a large fraction of the universities in Europe. And I think it gives us a very, very strong position to both understand the needs of standards, but also support the implementation and the use of standards as the default in data management. It also comes back to not the standards, but the implementation of standards in stable services. And this is something that we will drive and develop over the next years. So how do we maintain uniform identifiers for data? How do we make sure that people are aware of the standards? How do we make sure that there are easy services to map standards into your data set? How do we make sure that metadata can be uniformly encoded and used in submission to the core archives and so on? And of course, all of this technology isn't very useful unless there are skilled people that can help it. And we've set up a training program, and we're kicking off a training program. Now, I'll come back to one of the things that we're doing now with the training coordinators group to try to harmonize our approach to training across Europe, but also to link up the different training efforts in the different nodes and make sure that we support each other. So in 2014, one of the key events, I think, was the head of nodes and the technical coordinator workshop. So this really happened about 4 months into the life of the infrastructure, where we started to look at the real technical priorities for ELIXIR, and we also articulated what we think are the key operational priorities for ELIXIR in 2014 and 2015. It was hosted by the Swedish node, beautiful weather in the Swedish archipelago, and we had representation from all the ELIXIR nodes, I think. We also had 2 keynotes, which I was very happy. So one was from the Human Protein Atlas, but we also had Jan-Erik Litton from the biobanking infrastructure that talked about how they are developing. Essentially, they started at the same time as ELIXIR and what their plans are for the next year. And I'll come back to how we followed that up, but I think it's a really important partnership for ELIXIR. The technical coordinators have been very, very active during last year, and they've set up a number of different task forces, and some of these have already read out. Most of them are continuing, and a large part of them will continue during the large implementation grant that we've just submitted a proposal for. And so in the area of compute and technical infrastructure, have a task force looking at cloud, we have a task force looking at storage, and we have a task force that look at how do you manage users across the infrastructure. And as this webinar series progresses, I think we will see interesting updates from many of these efforts from the technical coordinators. We have an effort around curating services from the different nodes into the service registry. And there's been a series of hackathons and meetings last year. And I think we're all eagerly awaiting the release of the registry now to see the results of those efforts. Around the data and the data resources, I think we have a very important task force that look at quality control monitoring and really harmonizing the metrics of the different resources. And this is important, not perhaps so much for the users as for the infrastructure, because we need to base our arguments for long-term sustainability on real facts about usage and impact. And I think it's very important as an infrastructure that we have a uniform approach and really can stand up behind the numbers that we are talking about. We also looked at the internal communication. We've had a task force that looked at document sharing within the infrastructure, and we've had a lot of effort around the website, where we're now rolling out websites for all the nodes based on a shared Drupal platform. And again, I think that will help a lot of the internal communication and will also save a lot of efforts within the infrastructure. We had 2 task forces around training, and they have now moved into the training coordinators group, which I'll come back to in a minute. And I think that's really been good to see how that is kicking off. And of course, this year we are starting to have a training program, starting with the software and the data carpentry training, where the UK node is partnering with most of the other nodes to deliver trainings. And of course, in the standards area, we kicked off with a few workshops around bring your own data and interoperability in practice. For ELIXIR as a large infrastructure, I think it's also important that we do articulate our common priorities. And of course, these are rooted in the scientific program, but the scientific program doesn't give a lot of details on what we do every month within the infrastructure. So when we looked at this at the head of node and the technical coordinator workshop, I think we came up with 3 things that we need to deliver and focus on in 2014 and 2015. And you will see how this is now shaping up the choice of pilots, the choice of technical activities, and also how we approach other events and activities within the infrastructure. So the first one, and I think this is really important, and today is an example of this, is to build the ELIXIR community. There are a lot of people involved in ELIXIR, and of course internal communications and operational policies will be a challenge. Who is responsible for what? Where can I find information about ELIXIR pilots? Who will take a decision of what by when? And what are the groups working on, say, cloud, on our training strategy, on our e-learning strategy, and so on. And again, I think we have a large effort or piece of work ahead of us to get that working within the 100 or so institutes and the many hundred people involved in the infrastructure. We need to establish, and we have established, quite a few of the working groups. And of course, we need to work with our sister infrastructure, the other biomedical research infrastructures, Eurobioimaging, EU OpenScreen, the biobanks, but also the translational and the clinical trials infrastructure. And I think we will look forward to start some technical pilots together with the other infrastructures. And indeed, in 2 weeks' time, there will be a workshop with Eurobioimaging on management of imaging data. The second priority is, of course, to lay the foundation for the long-term sustainability of our core data resources. And I think this is about understanding what really amounts, which are the resources and services that we need to focus on within the infrastructure. But as I said, I think it's also important that we establish the fact space for these services. And this feeds into how ELIXIR helped to shape the policy landscape for research data in Europe. Again, perhaps not something that most of the users will see or be aware of, but for the resource owners and the services within the ELIXIR infrastructure, this is very, very important. And we have just started a working group, a senior working group that involves also representatives from our board to look at how we will drive more the policy side of this forward within ELIXIR. So I think, again, this is something we'll come back to during the year and perhaps will be a topic of a different webinar. And the third one is, of course, to deliver useful services into our large user community. There is 500,000 life scientists in Europe, and a very large fraction of those will use ELIXIR services. I think almost all of them will produce life science research data that needs to be managed one way or another. So we need to deal with a very large and very heterogeneous user community. The first part of this is, of course, to develop the collaboration agreements and service delivery plans with our ELIXIR nodes. And I know many of you who are on the webinar today has been deeply involved in this and developing the node proposals and now reshaping those into ELIXIR service delivery plans. This is work that's ongoing, and I hope we'll conclude that for most of the nodes during this year. And I think it's really important. It gives the infrastructure a solid foundation and the permanence that we need, but it also gives us the clarity on who is responsible for what, which we really use to develop a unified approach to data management in the life sciences. Of course, we need to kick off the training program, and as I said, we've started that with the software carpentry, and we need to establish the interface with the different disciplines and communities within life sciences. How do we work with rare disease researchers? We had a very good workshop with plant and agricultural bioinformatics resources last summer, and we're following that up with a focused workshop, a topical workshop around marine bioinformatics, also reaching out to EMBRC, which is the marine biology infrastructure here in the beginning of March. So in 2014, we started 4 new pilot actions. And for those of you who are not within the infrastructure, pilot actions are short technical projects within ELIXIR that we use either to drive the connection of national or local resources into the infrastructure, or more commonly to try out and test out technical solutions before we roll them out broader within ELIXIR. And the third area of pilot actions is, of course, to connect up communities. And I think that the 3 pilot actions in 2014 are good representatives of all the areas. So the first one is around exploitation of core data and standardizing the approach to assignment of functions within metagenomics, focus on marine applications. That's a pilot going on, being led from our Norwegian node with partners from EBI in the metagenomics portal. And actually within the proposal for InfraDev3, we're now broadening that out, and quite a few other nodes are interesting. And again, I think it's a good example of how we're trying to leverage the large resources to really standardize production pipelines for applied research in many different fields. And indeed, I think this will identify real bottlenecks for the marine field and then come up with a roadmap how we can address those within the infrastructure. The second pilot action is around proteomic archives, and in my mind is a really good exemplar of how we start to connect national archives with the large international reference data sources. So this is a pilot that's going on between Sweden and, again, PRIDE at the EBI. Sweden have for many years developed a national proteomics archive, and we're now looking at how we can connect that up with PRIDE so that researchers within Sweden will not have to submit 2 times. And also long term, we're looking into how we more effectively can manage large volumes of raw spectral data using national archives. Technically, this has turned out to be quite challenging, which is again underlines why it's important to have pilot projects. But I think the direction of travel is very, very clear. This is a good exemplar of what we want to do with most of our nodes, and see how we can use the established national archives, but then build on the established international data sharing mechanisms to open them up for the large communities. The third pilot that we've kicked off is looking at human research data, or say human data consented for research use, I should say. And that's centered around the European Genome Phenome Archive, a database of that's hosting human data, which is not open but needs managed access. And the pilot project here has been looking at using Globus FTP for secure and efficient data transfer. So how can you set up security mechanisms and data transfer mechanisms for these sensitive data archives, so that you have a good process for sharing data between nodes. And EGA, as many of you know, is now a joint venture between the Spanish node, the CRG in Barcelona, and EBI. So of course this also have a direct impact on service delivery, or a direct benefit, I should say, for service delivery in the EGA. And the fourth area where we looked at and we've supported from the hub is on the curation of tools for the service registry. So the development of the encoding of tools from different nodes, and hosting a series of hackathons and curation workshops to make sure that we capture both national and other registries, but also start to encode national tools in the service registry. So it's underpinning our mapping efforts. And I think I should say that all 4 of these are ongoing, and we hope they will be finalizing during the first half of this year. And you will hear updates from all of these pilot actions in due course during this webinar series. And indeed, the EGA data transfer and the service registry are the 2 next upcoming webinars. So again, I don't want to talk a lot about organization, but this is a frequent question from people, how these different activities are governed. And of course, we want to be clear that the ultimate governance of ELIXIR sits with the ELIXIR board. These are the representatives of our member states. And actually the framework agreement for ELIXIR is quite clear on what the ELIXIR board needs to sign and agree on. And that includes actually quite a lot of commissioning of services from the different nodes. But what I really want to talk about on this slide is the 3 groups that we are now either have established or are planning to establish. So the technical coordinator group, the training coordinator group, and the data coordinator group. And these are comprised of the national representatives, the national technical training and data coordinators, and are led by the the technical, the training, and the data coordinator at the ELIXIR Hub. For the training, we don't have a training coordinator, so it's actually led by Rita from the UK node, but long term, this is the way we're traveling. And the purpose of these groups is really to start to tie together the deliveries within the infrastructure. And I know I talked about the technical coordinator group. They've been very active in 2014. The training coordinator group was started in November of 2014, so they're only about 2 months old, but already we've seen a tremendous amount of activity, and the training program is really shaping up. And again, I think this webinar series will be an important mechanism for sharing out the activities from these groups, so you will hear from them in due course. We're also starting up or planning to start up a group around data coordinator that will really look at how we harmonize data management across the ELIXIR infrastructure. And we're currently recruiting for a data coordinator, so this is something that you will hear more about in due course. And again, I think that will be a topic of a forthcoming webinar. One of the key elements of ELIXIR is really around these core data resources. And during the last part of last year, we've had quite good discussions that really start to clarify how we work with them. And I'd like to share some of that with you. And the ELIXIR core data resource is really a subset of the data resources and archives in Europe. In the ELIXIR preparatory phase, over 1,800 databases were mapped out in Europe. But yet we know that, and that's a rapidly growing number, and yet we know that there are a small number of data resources that are really of fundamental importance to life sciences. They are either large archives or repositories that manage data for the long term. That could be, example could be the European Nucleotide Archive or the Protein Data Bank, or there are more of knowledge bases that are capturing our current understanding of biology and make that more accessible for the large user community. And of course, UniProt or Ensemble are good examples that essentially are defining our knowledge of proteins and genes for reuse in the data community. But these ones are really of fundamental importance for the preservation of reuse and biological data. But I think there's something more. And they are really defining the authority on defining and mapping data identifiers. And the reason why I want to talk about that is that these will be really the focal point of our technical but also science policy actions. And really these core data resources and the authority they provide when it comes to define what is a protein, what is a gene, what is a data set, will drive a lot of our interoperability efforts. And this will be one of the themes that will roll out in 2015, so I think it's important to highlight that. In 2014, we started to develop agreements with our sister infrastructures, as I said, and the first one was a joint technical strategy with Eurobioimaging that started to outline how data bridges for these imaging atlases would work. And of course, Eurobioimaging again is an emerging infrastructure. They are they're just about to form their ERIC and will probably be launched in 2015. And I think it's really important that we start to understand how we will work with the map, with the biomolecular data, which is really the focus point of ELIXIR, and how this is linked in to the cellular and the different model organisms and cellular atlases. And this will be one of the topics of a forthcoming workshop, as I said. And I also know that there's been quite a bit of activity following on from this technical strategy, where several groups, both within Eurobioimaging and ELIXIR, now applying for joint funding to start to link up the cellular atlases with the biomolecular data. So again, I hope within 2015 we'll start to see some results from this technical strategy. Similarly, we had a workshop with BBMRI to try to agree and develop the areas for future collaboration. And we identified 3 areas where we really want to work together as infrastructures and share responsibility. And the 3 areas around secure data access and data management of sensitive human research data, but also on ELSI. And I think that the last point, the ELSI, is interesting because the BBMRI infrastructure is building up a very comprehensive network of ethical legal guidance and experts across Europe. And essentially we are working towards using that infrastructure within ELIXIR to be able to leverage that both on the national and international level. We're also looking at how we can join up some of our efforts around data management, deposition of large sensitive data sets, but also harmonize our methods to secure data access. And of course, BBMRI is now developing their own core IT services, and it's really important that we link up fundamental services such as user access or data exchange protocols, so that the research projects will not have to struggle with two different or a multitude of different systems. So again, we are working on identifying a number of concrete projects and developing an MOU. And again, in 2015, I think you will see the readout of that, of those efforts. And the last important partnership is with NIH. So last year, 2014, NIH appointed an associate director for data science, and that is coming in conjunction with a very large investment in data management, which they call the Big Data to Knowledge Initiative, the BD2K. The first set of BD2K centers were awarded in 2014, and there are in several BD2K centers which also have European and ELIXIR partners. And actually last week we had a joint workshop on data identifiers that we're looking at how we can harmonize data access and data identification protocols between two infrastructures. And I think it's very good that we have managed to join up within Europe, so they see ELIXIR as a very national speaking partner for Europe. And of course, I think this will really help, especially in the area of standards. And joining up with US, with say Canada and Australia, and through collaborations also with part of Asia, I think is fundamental. We don't want to have 4 or 5 different standards for describing genes, proteins, or indeed data sets in the life sciences. So this again will be one of the areas that we focus on in 2015. The last 2014 highlight is, of course, that ELIXIR was prioritized as one of the top 3 research infrastructures in Europe. That came with the opportunity to apply for a rather large implementation grant. Many of you who are on the line now have spent most of Christmas, the last part of last year and Christmas writing this grant. So thank you very much for that. We successfully submitted here for two weeks ago. So what I thought I would do is just to say a few words on what we're planning to do and how this will really help to implement the ELIXIR program. So the first thing to note is if we're implementing a new infrastructure, we really need to focus on the 3 areas. And these map, of course, very well to the priorities. We need to build the organization, both nationally and internationally. We need to make sure our research infrastructure services are of high quality and reach most of our users. And we need to train both our users and all of us involved within the infrastructures we actually can deliver support. And these are the 3 areas which we're looking to, where we're asking for support from the European Commission. This is done over 13 work packages. It's a big and rather complex grant. But again, I think it sits in these 3 areas. We are building up our core technical infrastructure. We're trying to drive that through 4 different use cases. 2 of them are feeding data into the infrastructure. 2 of them are exemplars for how you leverage the infrastructure. And then we are supporting this with organizational and people development. And at that level, it's a relatively straightforward program. And I think we all hope that this will come through. And again, I want to thank all of you online who have spent a lot of effort over the last 2 or 3 months to get this proposal together. So with that, I'd like to finish off with a few slides outlining the plans for 2015 and then open up for questions. And of course, I'll come back to these priorities. These are also the priorities for 2015. And the top priority, I think, is to build a community. This is the starting point. Unless we manage to establish effective internal communication and a sense of community within the infrastructure, many of the other things will be very, very hard. And this feeds on to the pilot proposals that we are now have agreed and are rolling out. So the first priority is the training, and I think training is an excellent way of helping the community to form, and of course it's also a really important way of supporting our users. And so this year we are rolling out the software carpentry training across a number of nodes together with the Software Sustainability Institute. The second priority and the pilot action is around capacity building in our nodes. And actually, our SAB was very enthusiastic about this proposal and recommended us of accelerating it further. So we will look into over the next 2-3 weeks how we can make additional investment in supporting our national nodes, not only in building the networks and the organizations, but really on how to leverage this to jointly attack problems such as genome annotation or data sharing. And then I think the third priority is to find out how we effectively use the connections within our nodes. So of course, many of the institutes and resources within ELIXIR have strong links to our sister infrastructures, to big projects like the Research Data Alliance and to other important initiatives. And we need to find an effective way of using those contacts within the infrastructures to essentially speak on behalf of ELIXIR. So that's our third priority. I should also say that we had a lot of ideas for pilot actions last year, and we are currently working on consolidating those proposals, and we will come back to both the tech and the training coordinator group to look at priorities following a head of node meeting here in 2 weeks' time. We're also opening up 2 new posts at the ELIXIR Hub, and the first one is around the data coordinator. So this is a role that really will be the driver behind the long-term strategy for our core data resources. It's a person that will drive the science policy development of how we support the sustainability of life science data, but it's also will also address and try to implement uniform approaches to important questions such as data security and data policies. So I think many of you know, but it was only a week ago that the website of one of our sister infrastructures, the ENRI, the Environmental Research Infrastructures, was taken down by a hacker attack. And actually, data security is something that we need to take increasingly very, very serious within the infrastructure. And then, of course, this role will have an important focus in supporting data management across Europe, look at archiving processes, and really support the development of scalable strategies for data management. So if we look at the ELIXIR Hub, so the secretariat here in Hingston, there are 3 areas where we will really ramp up in 2015. And the first is the ELIXIR SME program. We established that in 2014 with the first workshop in Copenhagen, which was well attended and I think very, very successful. We currently have 2 workshops scheduled, one in the Netherlands and one in Switzerland. And we're actually aiming to run 3 to 4 workshops per year, so there is still room to more. The Dutch workshop is coming up here in about 8 weeks' time, and we'll focus on using public open research data for agricultural research. We have a number of speakers from actually external companies, but also from ELIXIR nodes that are coming together. And we currently have that open for registration for SME and biotech companies in Netherlands, and also outside Netherlands and Belgium if people are willing to travel. The ELIXIR services is of course important. As I said earlier, the focus now is really on concluding all the collaboration agreements, service plans that will involve a lot of you in the nodes. But we will also need to support this with key performance indicators and establish the effective reporting needed in an infrastructure. We will also, of course, support the services. So we're developing a program for best practice in software and service delivery. And this will be one of the topics of the forthcoming All Hands workshop. And then, as I said, I think establishing the internal and external communication channels, including the node website, is really a focal area. And we're currently recruiting a communication and community outreach officer to the ELIXIR Hub to drive this forward. So I came back to capacity. I mentioned capacity building a couple of times. And again, it comes back to the importance of building the community and driving scientific networks. And this, again, will be one of the topics in our forthcoming All Hands workshop. We have a pilot funded in the area. But I think it's really important that we now, with several of the ELIXIR nodes, are really newly established national infrastructure, and we need to look at how we can support them from the broader community. We also need to look at how we can support staff exchange models, but also simple things like hackathons and workshops that bring the community together around specific topics. And again, I mentioned the plant workshop, the marine workshop, and I think we're looking for further opportunities this year to bring together the key experts and the user support experts in the node and really try to help them to develop professional communities of practice that support them in supporting users. So I want to finish up with a plug for the All Hands workshop. This is bringing everyone together who's active within the infrastructure. It's over 100 participants, and I think the registration is going very well. It's almost full. So we're trying to prioritize those who are very active within the nodes. We are developing the program. Many of you have suggested sessions. Thank you for that, and we'll come back to all of you who have suggested sessions within the next week or two to develop this further. It will also feature posters and demos, of course. The outcome of this workshop, and I think this is important, this will be an annual event, is really to look and plan forward within the infrastructure. What are the priorities? So this is not an open community meeting, it's a meeting within the infrastructure. But again, we need always to be user-focused, and I think it's important that we look at what are the priorities for delivering services to our users. So with that, I'd like to thank you for your attention, and I'll open up for questions.